It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.
Well, welcome. It's Islands at War podcast with me, Keith Bengelli, and my co-presenter, Nick Lahuri.
Hi, Keith. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Okay, Nick, we're up to January 1941 in our month-by-month account of the occupation of the bailiwick of Guernsey. So for new listeners, we've taken each month the occupation of Guernsey, which started in June. There is a pilot episode, and we take every month and we cover off events that happened during the month or events that span several months. So without further ado, we'll go straight in, with the exception, Nick, that we've had quite a few people get in contact with us, and I just want to give a sort of little roll call here. So we had Mark contact us, also Roger, Ian, Paul, and especially Andy Kreber, and of course Charlie Roberts beavering away in the background with a little bit of research. So thanks to you gentlemen, and certainly Andy, the information that you sent us on your family connections, we will certainly get to that in due course in some detail. So really thank you. Anyone that wants to get in contact with us, email address is occupied at gnetradio.com, occupied at gnetradio.com. So anyway, Nick, social affairs before military affairs, and we, as always, we delve into many of the diaries and historical accounts that were kept during the war. And Nick, you do your business with the newspaper cuttings and your own personal archive.
Yep.
Okay, so Reverend Ord, who we reference regularly, wrote a very, very good diary account of the occupation. He's talking about here, Nick, for January 1941, warning of the death penalty for those that persist in keeping pigeons. Now, Nick, is this for security reasons?
Yes, and essentially they were worried about people sending messages off the island or receiving messages by carrier pigeon. The first notice went out was September 1940, was in the paper. I've got a slightly later one here from 1941, but they refer back to that earlier one. It appeared numerous times, so they clearly thought people were still doing it. But one of the curious things, it says, with reference to the order relating to carrier pigeons dated September 20th, 1940, attention is drawn once more to the fact that keeping and the use of carrier pigeons or any other pigeons is liable to the death penalty, or in less serious cases to imprisonment. I'm not really sure
how you would decide.
how you would decide it's a less serious case.
I can imagine that. Well, I can't imagine really, but this almost as that they'd put it to the pigeon to decide.
Yeah. So they were worried about it because they were obsessed with the fact that there might be messages sent to or from the island by people with carrier pigeons.
Yes, and I see that the I think you'll put this up on our Facebook page. This is the Feld Commandantur in St Helier, which is in Jersey, offers to pay a reward for every carrier pigeon found and delivered. So what do they do with the pigeons? Probably ate them.
I would imagine they probably ate them. Yeah,
but
that would be the case.
For all our levity, this is a serious case. Death penalty or imprisonment with or without hard labour. So interesting notion of breaches of security there. Whilst we're on the subject of avian friends, poultry keepers on the island have been warned to thin out their flocks by 50%, as there are only feed rations for the birds for a lower quantity of birds, 50%. And so really by doing so, they're going to cut down on egg production as well, aren't they?
They are, yeah. It does have consequences, and particularly later on in the war as well, when they could have done with the poultry just to provide food.
Yeah, I mean, again, January 41, 6-7 months of occupation, but still very, very new to everybody concerned, Germans and local authorities. And so decisions now would have had some rationale, but of course 2 or 3 years down the line, no one foresaw the occupation lasting that long. And of course, there are legacy issues of decisions being made now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's another interesting one. Again, the Reverend Ord in his diary discusses the fact that one of our local supermarket chains, which exists to this day, Le Riche, they had advised the population of the Channel Islands, their customers, to build up home supplies of non-perishable goods. And the Riche themselves built up supplies accordingly, similarly, in their own warehouses. And this is not because they foresaw the occupation happening. It's because they foresaw that the war itself would disrupt sea supplies to the islands. And even though we may not have had occupied forces stationed here, this was a prudent move to build up food security, you'd call it, Nick. And then, of course, we were occupied, but all of this good work went down the pan because the Germans started to buy everything.
Absolutely. I mean, they just went. I don't know if they did it because they were thinking, well, we're not going to be here very long. We're off to England soon. We're going to go and invade England, so it doesn't matter if we, are buying up all the supplies here. And we talked in the last episode about reports of a German soldier, gorging himself on butter. But there are other reports in German officer coming in to Le Riche and demanding another 500 tins of salmon. The emphasis being on another, so he'd already had 500 tins of salmon. Yeah,
and it's interesting to note that this supply build-up within the warehouses of one supermarket chain was 3 years' supply. Now, this is something we could do with now.
Yeah, absolutely.
When the boat doesn't come in. So this was really quite far-sighted. And as I say, I must sort of emphasise, this is not because we would be occupied, but it was in the event that we weren't occupied, but it was simply a shipping disruption due to a world war.
Absolutely. The problem as well was for the people that had taken the advice and stocked up, had lots of dry goods and tin goods in their larders or stored somewhere in their house, was that of course the Germans issued that order we talked about a few months back in 1940, where they ordered effectively a census of what people had, and stuff ended up getting redistributed.
Yeah, because the thing turned on its head, and a prudent stock of food supplies was then regarded as hoarding.
Yeah, exactly, and you were getting into trouble for that. So
it was redistributed, eaten by German forces, or sent back home.
Yeah. There was a lot of that. They sent stuff back home. Not so much food that they sent back home, but other goods that they could buy in Guernsey that they perhaps hadn't been able to get their hands on previously. So stockings and things like that, and clothes. All sorts of bits and pieces. They also sent back, antiques and things like that.
Yeah. So here we had another very, very prudent and sensible practicality is completely blown apart by short-sighted decisions to act now with no foresight at all.
Yeah, although to be fair, it was. I know I keep banging on about this, but they were kind of left holding the baby, the civilian government here. It was best of luck, chaps. Do your best. And there was no instruction book for them to say, right, this is what you should do in the event of being occupied. Particularly when they didn't know it was going to go on for until May 1945.
Yeah, and again, our favourite Reverend Ord describing, he came home one day and could smell this. It's quite pleasant smell. He says it was parsnips being roasted for parsnip coffee, and he was describing this as most effective. Now, I think have you got I think we've got a coffee recipe here somewhere.
No. It's actually what it is I found in the Guernsey Press from the 16th of January 1941. Some witty chap. Or lady had written in a letter which was entitled "What's in a Name," and It says, "Sir, it seems that there is much interest to be aroused in the name of a beverage." And he goes on to say he's been thinking about anagrams to coin for this beverage. So he starts off with Rip Snap. Pass Corey is another name for he comes up with for it, which is a reference to the fact that as well as parsnip, it was chicory as well that was used, or chick nip. I rasp corny chips. Sorry, chip panic. And then he gets down to things like wrap office pens, offers nice pap, office snapper, and then he comes up with some slightly more sinister ones: pace off sniper, and coffins appear.
Yeah, so somebody with a lot of time on their hand here, I think, as well.
Yeah, I think so. I've tried. A friend of mine made some parsnip coffee as an experiment, just to see what it was like. I've tried it. It doesn't really taste anything like coffee. I mean, if you've not had a coffee for a year, maybe you might think it tasted vaguely coffee-y.
Yeah, did you have milk with it?
No, I always drink black coffee anyway.
Oh, right, okay.
I might have been better off, actually, if I put milk in it.
There's something like, what's it called? Condensed milk. Yeah, anyway,
it doesn't bear. But as we've already alluded to in other episodes, invention comes about through desperate times.
Yeah, necessity is the mother of invention.
That's the one. So they end up having to come up with substitutes for all sorts of different things. Tea as well was a really big thing, because if you actually had some real tea to be able to make a cup of tea, that was basically, shortly into 1941, it was a case of you only did that if you had some special visitors at the house. It's a bit like guest biscuits when you're you've got the posh biscuits for when you've got visitors coming round or whatever. Making a cup of tea was basically,
or saving it for birthdays. And,
exactly. You'd be
Christmas.
You'd be drinking the ersatz version of tea made out of bramble leaves or whatever. To try and preserve what you did have. You see adverts in the papers where people are offering to buy tea bags,
or swap a pair of trousers for 6 ounces of tea or something.
Yeah, something like that. And people were asking, particularly for tea, actually, a ridiculous amount for it, because you just couldn't get it for large chunks of the occupation.
Okay, so we move on also to the fact that the civilian population are suffering from all sorts of stresses. That Simmons, the health services officer, reporting in the Guernsey Press, the local paper, that the effects of vitamin A is also making itself visible through he's seeing cases, and also warning early on in the war of epidemics such as flu, bronchitis, pneumonia, and something called night blindness, which I think when Nick and I had a brief discussion, we think it's something to do with possibly impaired vision at night due to the lack of vitamin A. And then also, as we go through our the diarists that we trust, who wrote pretty accurate accounts of the war, Violet Carey was writing in January 1941 about asylum admissions being up due to the pressure brought around people because of the constant air raids, and all reporting that people being admitted to psychiatric hospital due to strain and depression. People living up near Carey, Joyce Carey actually lived in near the airport, and I think that they saw a lot of activity at that time. We had a raid in December 1940, I think, and so there was a lot of activity around the airfields, and of course this caused a lot of anxiety and stress for people, and of course also the worry about their loved ones being away in the UK without hearing them about them or from them too much.
Yeah, there's certainly there were plenty of air raids on the airport during the whole of the occupation. To be honest, it received attention. The Germans also initially had concentrated a lot of the heavier weaponry around the airport here in the harbour to initially defend those before they moved on to making more more widespread fortifications. But we talked in an earlier episode, I think it was to do with the raid in August 1940, where there was that report of bravery. I think we talked about it in the September episode because it was an article I'd found in September. But an act of bravery, because that chap just went and the fireman went and removed an unexploded bomb that the Germans had just left basically at the side of the road that had come from an air raid, and they didn't want to touch it.
Yes, and so this is all grinding people down. I referred also to Red Cross messages starting to get through. It's reported by in the local papers and also by diarist Ralph Durand. Red Cross messages were getting through in some numbers now and are kept for collection in a newly set up administrative office, which happened to be in Elizabeth College, which is in the upper suburbs of St. Peterport. Messages had to be picked up in person, Nick, which meant quite a journey, especially from outer parishes. So what was happening is people, and Nick will go on to explain in a second, but people were being appraised, and I didn't personally know how this would happen, but people were told that they had a message. They had to walk into St. Peterport or cycle, simply to pick the message up and return home. So this would have been around a journey of around some miles. For the outer parishes, could be about a 10-mile journey for a message that would only have been maybe one or two short sentences. But Nick, you've got some information on how people actually knew that they had a message to go and collect.
Yeah, absolutely. They received a card through the post. So the Red Cross message was held at the Red Cross Bureau.
So it arrives at the administrative office. Your message was held there,
and then you received a card through the post, and the postman delivered it, which advised you that I've got one in front of me here actually, and it says a communication for you has been received through the International Red Cross from, and they'd fill in the gap with who the message was from. And then it said, if you will call at Elizabeth College between 10:30 a.m. and 12:30 p.m. on any morning, or between 2:30 p.m. and 5 p.m. on any afternoon, brackets except Thursday, because of course early closing on Thursdays. You can
the very time that you might have been free to go and get it, the office was closed.
The office was shut. Yeah,
things never change.
You can see the communication and send a reply not exceeding 25 words. So they were very short messages. I think the first ones were just limited to 10 words.
Yeah, it's very, very short.
So you can't say a lot in that, and you had to basically give your reply while you were there. If you do not call within 7 days of the above date, it will be concluded that you do not wish to send a reply, and it was issued by a Mr. Bradshaw from the Red Cross department, and it said on the bottom, important, please bring this card with you. So yeah, you had to take it with you to prove it was your message. Now, because it was from Mr. Bradshaw, these very quickly became referred to by the local population as Bradshaw cards. So that somebody would say, "Oh, where are you going?" "Oh, I've had a Bradshaw card. I'm off to get my message."
So it sort of entered the contemporary vernacular at the time.
Absolutely. And one of the things as well that I've also been reading up on recently is I've been looking at the British newspaper archive, and there are numerous reports of people in the UK who've evacuated being extremely worried about their relatives not knowing what's happened to them in the Channel Islands. And the fact that they've not been able to communicate, and then you start seeing the bits of announcements in the papers that there are these messages that are starting to get through, but they do take a long time to get here. You're looking at 3 months for one to arrive here, and then the reply to get back to the UK. So it's like sending a very short text message, but it takes 3 months to get.
Yeah, sending it from miles one way.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, people were listening because people still here had their radios, and of course they would hear about the Blitz on various population centres in the UK. people would have known perhaps by now that the main body or the main concentrations of Guernsey people and ordinary people that had evacuated would have been in the Greater Manchester area and would have been in the Glasgow areas, and so they would have known that their families were in areas of constant and sustained bombing. So the worry was acute.
Very much so. Yeah, they just had absolutely no idea, what the truth was about these bombing raids on the UK. They were certainly aware of them from the BBC. Obviously, the BBC didn't give away too much information because basically that would be telling the Germans, left a bit, you missed that bit of London, or you didn't hit the dockyards, or whatever. You hit the wrong place. So they very quickly stopped saying exactly where places were. They used to say things like a city in the north, which could either be Manchester, Liverpool, or further north than that, rather than giving too much information away. Interestingly, with you saying about people ending up in Scotland, I found that the Scottish newspapers in the British newspaper archive are actually a great source of information about what was going on with Channel Islanders during the evacuation. I come up with lots and lots of articles from Scotland, particularly the Dundee Herald seems to have an awful.
So what's this sort of social groupings or people meeting for tea or
all sorts of things? Talks being given. So there'll be an announcement that either there is a talk coming up to at a parish hall or whatever, or to a particular group. So WI, that sort of thing. Or there'll be a report of the talk that somebody from the Channel Islands who'd been evacuated actually came along and gave a talk, and this is what they talked about, sort of thing. So those are quite an insight into what people were thinking who had been evacuated.
So this is up in Scotland, and have you found similar in the Manchester area?
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of reports around there as well, but it just seems that there's an awful lot in Scotland.
Well, we must bring all this together and perhaps do a special or certainly feature how the various groups coalesced, and of course this brings in Sir Donald Banks, because he set up the Guernsey Review.
Channel Islands Monthly Review.
Yeah. We'll do something on that. Certainly towards when we get towards the 80th anniversary of the occupation, which of course is in May next year, in a year's time. Okay. Now the other thing, Nick, that caught my eye was the situation with postage stamps here in the bailiwick. Durand was reporting that, and Winterflood, local stocks of 1 penny stamps were now exhausted, and to take their place, 2 penny stamps were allowed to be cut diagonally, and the halves used as 1 penny stamps. And I've got some in my possession, and you've got them, and they're quite famous. So this was seen to be a temporary measure, though, wasn't it?
It was a temporary measure, and they did get around to having to print new stamps. The problem was all caused again predominantly by the fact that the Germans, there seemed to be a lot of them that seemed to be stamp collectors, or they were sending them back home to relatives who were stamp collectors, and they were just buying them up.
So it was a false usage.
Yeah, it wasn't being used for. It wasn't the case that there was such a vast volume of post within the island that was causing the problem. It was the fact that they were buying them in large numbers. In fact, they put a limit on the stamps. You couldn't buy more than 10.
Yes, I saw that the German authorities also applied their own controls because of this. The use, or rather, the collection by philatelists. Is that right?
Philatelists,
yes. Just a curious thought. I mean, for local communications, were telegrams still being used locally?
That I don't know. I'd have to check actually as to whether they were. I'm not sure.
Because I'm of an age, I actually remember telegraph boys over here with these little mopeds they used to go around.
Yeah.
This would be in the early 60s, showing my age. That's something we'll look into.
One other thing actually to do with post is I'm not sure if this is a rumour, but I've seen it referred to in a number of cases. And it is stamp related. There was a rumour going around in January 1941 that a letter from England had been posted in a Guernsey post box with a Guernsey stamp to a lady over here, which a lot of people inferred meant that there'd been yet another commando raid, because this was apparently happened in January 1941. I can't find anything that either confirms or
so this
or disproves that. You know, it may well just be one of those rumours, one of the many rumours that used to fly around the island. You know, because people just didn't have information. So
interesting notion. So the commander comes over here with a letter in his pocket in an envelope with no stamp on.
Where would he have got the stamp?
Where would he have got the Guernsey stamp in the first place?
That was my initial thought. Where would he have got the stamp? I suppose it's not impossible. He might have had a Guernsey stamp, you know, with him when he went to the UK. Who knows? Yeah,
I think I'd have probably believed it if it had happened at a point where we know there had been a raid. Yeah. Then it wouldn't have been empirical, but I think it would have more legs. Yeah.
So I'm really not sure, but I do hope it's true, because that would have been brilliant.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on, and associated with health, of course, is the fact that there's a local man, George Simmons. In fact, I used to work with his son. George was a butcher in St Sampson's, but he also ran a cinema that has been gone a long time, but we're of an age that we still refer to the North Cinema. So George set up a free soup kitchen that served over 160 pints of soup per day. So he was feeding over 100 people daily. I mean, you know, even if it was the most meagre potato and veg soup, that's a lot of soup. There's a lot of ingredients to be brought together.
Yeah,
I wonder where he was getting all of that from.
He must have had some assistance from the local authorities, because he just wouldn't have been able to get his hands on that very easily. These soup kitchens carried on throughout the war, and communal baking became a thing later on in the war, as it got scarce supply of wood or any other method to be able to cook. The electric was cut off in periods of time and things like that. But the other thing I find quite interesting about the soup kitchens was that it was predominantly set up at the start because men were here whose wives had gone away, who'd been evacuated. So you perhaps had men in, who were past military age or couldn't go and serve, so hadn't gone to the UK, and they were stuck here. And oh my God, got to look after myself. I'm sure it was a steep learning curve for many of them. They had to learn how to do various things, cook being one, just one of them. And what happened at these soup kitchens as well was that some of the ladies that used to man the soup kitchens as volunteers, they do all sorts of other things as well. They do darn socks, repair clothes, even take the laundry for these men to go and help them out.
So this one in particular, now this does interest me because it's not far from this where we're actually sat recording this podcast. It's in the north of the island. Now, the North Cinema is now, in fact, a branch of Iceland, which has got some sort of I don't know what you'd call it, irony attached to it. But Simmons was also a butcher, as we've said. So I've got an almanac, 1940 almanac in the house. I must have a look. We'll try and find out where his butcher premises, because it'd be interesting to know where the soup kitchen itself was set up. This would have been one that would have serviced the people in the north of the island.
Yeah.
In reality, people couldn't take soup down to Cattel or up to Cattel or whatever. But yeah, I like that little piece of fact that it almost like you're going. I'm off to the soup kitchen now, but I must take my trousers with me to have them, or my socks to have them darned, etc. But again, the community coming together, because we must remember here that Guernsey, not so much now, but certainly in the 40s and prior to the war, was a hierarchical society. People still had servants, so there was a very much a working class that were poor. And so a lot of this would have been a sort of philanthropic, ladies doing good works, etc. But also, as you mentioned, many of these men that had sent their women and children away had no idea about even boiling an egg. They were just completely cut adrift. They had to still work. So these soup kitchens, played an enormous part in keeping people nourished and as a centre of some form of social contact. Yeah,
absolutely, and it also gave them the opportunity to learn how to do things themselves as well. They were shown how to do things.
Yeah, I'm going to try
as well as just foisting it on the volunteers at the soup kitchen. That they did have to learn new skills.
Yeah, well, George Simmons, known to be a very, very nice man, and the North Cinema itself shut, I think, in the very early 60s. I did work with George's late son, John, so I'm going to sort of make that a personal mission to try and find out exactly where the soup kitchen was. I suspect it was probably more so at the butcher's. Okay, so we move on. What have we got up next here? Oh yes, we closed off the Nicol Symes issue last month, but we should remember that earlier, in late 1940, the mother of both Desmond Mulholland and Philip Martell's mothers, both the mothers were sent away to. This would have been Mrs. Michael, as she was married to the artist Martha Michael. That was Mulholland, and then Mrs. Mazurier, who was Philip Martell's mother. They were both released from exile in France, Nick.
Yeah, they were the people we talked about in an earlier episode who had that who'd been sent to France, but they hadn't been put in prison. They'd been ordered that they had to live 15 miles away from the sea, which is odd because you would have thought the Germans would have said kilometres, but I'm not really quite sure how that happened. It may be that somebody at the time converted it to kilometre. In some of the records afterwards has converted kilometres into miles. I don't know, but they just had to live at least 15 miles from the sea and report to the police every day.
But it was all very genteel, that particular exile, because it was nothing like conditions in the Cherchy Midi prison, which we reported about last month. And in fact, Desmond Mulholland's mother, Dorothy Morehouse, who had married, although research into this shows that possibly they weren't, I've been in contact with the family, she was certainly let's just say they were married. She was married to Arthur Michael, an English artist that had settled on the island. And Arthur Michael, when his wife was exiled, he asked the Germans if he may accompany her in exile to France. So he signed over his possessions, his house, etc., to the French consul, Baron de Coudenhove, and his wife, who was the artist Elsie Henderson, and off he went. The Germans actually allowed Mrs. Morehouse, or Mrs. Desmond's mother, husband, to accompany her. So he went over and he came back. And of course, what we'll do, when we get to the appropriate month, we'll talk about them again, because they in turn were deported to Biberach when we got to the deportation of non-local but UK-born people. So that closes off that. They returned from France, and then we move on to more military matters. This is something that interests me a great deal, and we'll get onto it, but we'll talk about it. But Ord and Winterflood are talking about here more sections of coast now out of bounds, the south coast completely now out of bounds. Now, what I'd like to do in February, Nick, is talk about in some depth, that we'll just cover it off slightly now, the difference between the fortifications on the island from the arrival of German occupying forces to the point where the Hitler order for the Atlantic Wall was put into action. So the defences here, we'll just cover it off briefly, were a lot different to what we see now, with bunkers and the coastal areas. There were resistance nests. Can you just talk us through briefly on how they stood in January 1940?
Yeah,
41, sorry.
They were much more ad hoc. You're talking sort of sandbagged positions. They did have anti-aircraft guns, but it tended to be the lighter stuff. and they were centred around the airport and the harbour, unsurprisingly, and a few other key points around the island. But you didn't have the massive defences because, as we said earlier, it was early days. They're still settling in. They don't know how long they're going to be here. So let's face it: if you thought you were off to invade England and you were only going to be here for a couple of months, you're not going to start building massive fortifications.
No, and of course the south coast is particularly interesting because the south coast, for those that are unfamiliar with Guernsey's topography, the south coast are cliffs. So we're talking about from south of St Peter Port right the way through to the Plymouth area. So if you're looking at Guernsey and Guernsey is a triangle, you're talking about the one of the sides and then all along the bottom. But of course, Nick, the Ambassador Ray came ashore, and of course Le Chanet Beach is where Mulholland and Martel and Symes and Nickel came ashore. But there was a lot of, this is an area I was familiar as a child in the 60s. This was an area of some sensitivity to the Germans, wasn't it?
Absolutely, and so you get this order at the end of January 1941, which I've got a copy of it that was published actually on the 4th of February, but the order was given at the end of January. The notice was published a few times, but orders of the Commandant: it is forbidden to visit the coast southwards of Fort George, so basically anywhere from the south of St Peter Port, along the whole of the south coast, the coast of Torteval to the Imperial Hotel, and the coast of the peninsula, Fort Sommeray and Liu Island. These localities are extremely dangerous. Now, I've seen pictures of the area around Fort Sommeray at the time, and they were putting minefields in there, and also the other fortifications. I'm not really quite sure why they fortified that bit quite so much at that stage.
Well, my guess would be for that is that listeners might be pleased to know that the island was fortified, of course, in the late 18th century initially because of the French threat, which was pre-Napoleonic, and so we had loop towers, which still exist all along the coastal areas there, and we've got Fort Pézeray right at the end of Plymouth, and then we've got Fort Grey, a couple of sources known to us that was Germans had positions there, and then Fort Sommeray, of course, had the huge, great Kriegsmarine tower, which exists.
Which was built much later on. I'm not quite sure why they fortified that in that bit so early on. Why they had positions there. I guess it does give you a cracking view out over the bay, down all the way to the Imperial, etc. You could see shipping routes coming. It's very rocky around there. There's an awful lot of shipwrecks, so I'm not sure you would have chosen to try and come ashore there, particularly in any numbers.
No, but I think, for the want of a template, I think they pretty much followed the pre-Napoleonic and Napoleonic structures.
Oh yeah, they very much use those. When you look at the tower that's built out there, and people often get Martello towers and loophole towers confused. They're two different
Absolutely.
things. Loophole towers.
I explain this almost daily.
Yes, loophole towers are the ones that you see all over the shop around the island. But with the Martello towers, the true ones, there aren't that many in Guernsey.
Well, Fort Grey.
Fort Grey is one. It's a much wider,
bigger,
much bigger. Not as tall as. Typically not as tall. I mean, Brayon Tower is another example. If you've ever come into St Peter Port Harbour, you'll have seen Brayon Tower in the middle of the Russell there. That is the Martello Tower. Again, that was used by the Germans. But going back to Fort Sommeray, there was a large Martello Tower there, and the Germans, always being one to recycle fortifications, plonked on top of that the great big Kriegsmarine.
Now, it is Kriegsmarine, which is German Navy. It is, isn't it?
Yeah. They plonked their tower on there later on in the war. But I'm not sure I'd have wanted to sit there, because one of the if you are in Guernsey, you'll probably have seen, I think it was last week or the week before, on the causeway at Liu, unexploded shell from
Ordnance, yep.
from the Second World War was found. It's not an unusual thing to happen around that area. I don't think I'd have fancied being sat even in that tower later on in the occupation, because they used to use Liu for target practice, which is why why they get these things turning up around there more frequently than in other perhaps than in other places, because they used to shut off. You'd have people being moved out of the area, the civilian population, and roads closed, etc., because it was going to be dangerous because they were test firing their guns and things like that. So, yeah, I'm not sure I'd have wanted to sit there. I presume that they did actually.
Now, one of the reasons I think
positions.
the Kriegsmarine built these towers is that they hadn't quite perfected their radar. I was reading that by the time these towers were built, and they were built with slave labour, they were essentially, to a degree, obsolete. Would that be correct? Wow. Having perfected their radar to something approaching the Allies' capability, did that supersede the towers, or is that I think they kind of military myth?
Yeah, I think they kind of work hand in hand. But so if you go to the tower at Plymouth that's on the top there, just down from the tower itself is actually what was the radar bunker there. But these towers provided great view out over the islands because they've got multiple floors. You can see out. You can use them for other information. To be able to assess where your target exactly is if you are going to be passing instructions to a gun battery. Because what they used to do was they would paint on the wall. So if you were looking out through the observation slit that runs around the tower, they would paint like a mural with the key landmark features on it, and they would write the ranges. So that was immediately helping. They had rangefinders in there as well, anyway. Yeah. But that was, if you wanted to immediately have an idea of how far away a boat was, for example, they could do that very, very quickly. They might have detected it on their radar, but once it came into sight, that tower was obviously very important for being able to.
Yes, because the Kriegsmarine. And we'll get into this in the next episode, but the Kriegsmarine were a very important arm of the German service. There was this strange sort of seniority over the Wehrmacht here, which is out of kilter to the ratio of the troops to sailors, but we'll get on to that. But these towers would have been in contact with the Kriegsmarine headquarters at the Colonet Hotel, because this predates the building of the naval or the Kriegsmarine headquarters signals bunker, which for anyone that's thinking of coming over to Guernsey, the tower at Plymouth is open one afternoon a week, which is the Sunday.
Usually on a Sunday, yeah.
Sunday afternoon. It was purchased by Richard Hume, who's the owner of the best museum over here. But also, it would have been in contact with Kriegsmarine headquarters. Again, I think, Nick, will ask you to explain to listeners next
sure, absolutely.
Next episode why it was set up in Guernsey as opposed to Jersey.
Yeah.
And it'd be also interesting to cover off as to how there was going to be this sort of strange changeover should the islands have been attacked. The Navy was supposed to hand over to the Army. It was all very, very nebulous, and it would have been extremely difficult, I think, to negotiate on the fire, but we'll get into that. So next episode we'll be majoring, as the Americans say, in coastal and internal defences, the difference between what they were in the early stage and what they became under the Atlantic Wall. So if anybody out there that's got any questions about our defences in terms of situation, weaponry from the period approaching the Atlantic Wall, and I'm sure Nick is able to answer for the period that goes into the Atlantic Wall period, you can contact us on Occupied, which is occupied at gnetradio.com, and send those in, and Nick, I'm sure, will be able to give you more than adequate answers to that. So look forward to covering that off in the next episode.
Another thing, actually, Keith, just coming out of that, while I was looking at exactly which bits of the island were inaccessible to the locals at that point, there's actually a mention in Ord's diary of a boat not returning, by which he means escaped, and that wasn't one that I've got on my list.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to be looking into that. But there was a suspension of fishing again, brief one at that point. So I'll keep you posted on that one.
Okay, so we're talking about an attempted escape from Guernsey.
Yeah,
out.
So it would have been somebody going out on a fishing boat or something and escaping.
Yeah, just going back to Liu Island, I'm stationed Monday to Friday at Fort Grey, which we've mentioned during that brief conversation about defences, and it's only just along from Liu Island, and as Nick mentioned, ordnance was found and exploded. There was a warning, and it was exploded on Liu Island, and I actually you could feel the shock waves when they did. Now, to me, this finding of that type of ordnance seems to go hand in glove with ormering tides.
Yeah, these things, if it's just a normal tide, they don't often turn up. My understanding is this one, it was obviously rusty and brown, and the rocks around there were all rusty and brown, so it would have quite easily lain there undiscovered for quite some time. It does tend to be at the lower tides that these things turn up. But as I say, they used Liu Island frequently as for gun practice, effectively.
Yeah, because there was a priory on Liu Island, which the Germans used as site practice, and turned it into more of a ruin than it previously was. And you will remember, Nick, last summer in the Janet Bay area, there was a controlled explosion. A dog had fallen over the edge of the cliff, and in rescuing the dog, happily, they found an ignition mine or a roll mine.
It was a roll bomb. Yeah, there was a roll bomb that had some lain there since the end of the war. What used to happen with those were effectively usually large shells from for example, French battleship or something like that. They captured them instead of fusing them so that when it hit something it went off. They attached about a metre long cable to it, and which effectively started the fuse going, and they suspended them over the cliffs on these wires, and they just cut the wire and drop it down if you were trying to come up the cliff. Now, what happened was at the end of the war was that when they were clearing these up, they decided that the best way to deal with them was to get them down onto the beaches. So they went along and cut the fuse cable so that it wasn't arming the roll bomb, and then they cut the wires and dropped them down the cliff. Now, of course, they bounce into gullies, and so some were went missing during that process. So that's why they occasionally turn up.
Yes, and in fact, that where they found that particular one is only yards away from Janet Beach, where the spies came ashore, and it's only a few hundred yards from where I used to go fishing over 50 years ago. Myself and George Jennings used to go conger fishing there, and my father said there's lots and lots of ordnance around there, but he never stopped me going. So when they let that off, they gave on local Twitter, they gave a heads up that it was going to be exploding for people, I think, to close their windows or open their windows for percussion. Yeah,
it was filmed as well.
When it went off, I think it was filmed from the Gulf.
Yeah.
When it went off, I was at Fort Grey and I felt the percussion on my chest. That made quite a big bang. Okay, so next episode, an overview of initial defences. So send any questions you might have in about that to occupied@gnetradio.com. Right, I want to talk about now, Nick, towards the end of this particular podcast, about propaganda on the island, because Ord is referring to something called the Front Page, which you'll explain about in a second. The Front Page reporting that following a huge night raid over London, Goering is reporting that London looks like a heap of dust. So could you talk us through, Nick, about the German forces' propaganda and publications, German publications that might have been seen on the island, both by German military and also civilians.
Yeah, sure. Where he's referring to the front page, that will be the front page of the local newspapers, because the Germans took control of what was published in the newspapers, and generally speaking, that you could guarantee that the entire front page of the paper, unless there had been some significant local event, were dominated by propaganda stories, and so, sometimes the other pages as well. They used to frequently reprint things like Lord Haw, bits of his radio broadcasts and things like that. But they used to print all these stories about how they were doing fantastically well and destroying vastly more bits of Allied kit or towns and than they actually were, but that must have been quite distressing for the local people, because whilst they knew that these reports of the bombing raids on England, where potentially some of their relatives might be, were overblown, they just didn't know how bad things were, and obviously that was worrying for them. Now, in terms of German propaganda, they would have had German newspapers and magazines, albeit they wouldn't get here on the day they were published. Those would have been available, but later on in the war, the occupying forces used to publish their own forces newspaper. So Jersey actually had a German propaganda newspaper for the troops from 1940, which is I'm going to absolutely murder this now. Deutsche Inselzeitung.
Deutsche Inselzeitung.
Yeah, that's
I think
something like that.
So this is a Jersey publication.
That was published in Jersey. That was then they had a Guernsey version, which was published not until July 1942, but was published right up until 24th March 1945. It's published daily, so they'd have seen that sort of stuff as well. But of course, that was all in German. But so some people would have understood.
The Guernsey one was Deutsche Guernsey Zeitung,
yep.
DGZ, and it was a daily news sheet for German occupied forces. Excuse me, actually published by the Guernsey Press, by the Guernsey Press Company.
Yeah, the Guernsey Press Company had to publish it for the Germans because they obviously were controlling what they did.
So there wasn't an English language version of it. Have you got copies of this?
I do have a copy of one of those. Yes, I probably could put some examples on.
But it would have been presumably it would have been summarising German forces operations.
Oh, around the world, yeah.
In Europe. Because,
in Europe, yeah.
Because we're some months away from the invasion of Russia, or the attack on Russia, and of course Pearl Harbor is some way nearly a year ahead. So, yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I didn't know that the Guernsey Press was sort of dragooned into presenting or printing this propaganda for German troops. And also, you've got here. Who's Lord Portsea?
Okay, so Lord Portsea was Jersey-born, member of the House of Lords. Lived in London. He, throughout the occupation, was a bit of a pain in the neck for the government because he kept asking lots of questions, which were quite valid questions. But if they'd answered some of them truthfully, it would have given the game away that we knew a little bit more about what was going on in the Channel Islands than the Germans. They didn't know how much we knew, what we'd found on these missions, etc.
But he was an elderly chap, wasn't he?
He was, but he very much right from the get-go was quite a feisty chap. I'd say if you go and read the Hansard reports or read any of the newspaper reports. He certainly knew how to make a speech to get in the media. He did things like demanding that he be given 3 Navy ships so he could form up a group of Channel Islanders to come and retake the islands. That was early 1940, and various other things like that. He used to come up with all sorts of questions in the House of Lords. What are you doing about this? What are you doing about that? And I think it must have been a bit of a pain. But in January 1941, he was actually calling for more leaflets to be dropped on the Channel Islands, because they hadn't really been dropped since October.
So this would have been news sheets in English for the local population, both here and in Jersey.
Yeah. So the early leaflet raids in 1940 were predominantly just aimed at the civilian population to let them know what was going on, and then they sort of tail off, and later on, when leaflet raids come back, they turn into being propaganda to try and get the Germans to surrender. So it'll be stuff about how you're losing the war. Yeah.
But initially this would have been comfort sheets for the local.
Yeah, absolutely. So that they had some idea about.
Have you got some of these?
You have got one, yes.
Yeah, from this particular period or a bit later on?
A bit earlier on. I can put a picture up of that as well.
Yeah, well, Nick, for this, I can wave it at the microphone, but you can't see it. But Nick, I think there's a whole load of information for this particular episode. You're going to put up on the Facebook page. How do people find the Facebook page?
If they just search Islands of War in Facebook, it should pop up there. So there'll be some stuff on there. It's not very easy to put the pictures on in quantity in there. So what I tend to do is I'll put one or two of the pictures there, and then I'll put a link to the blog where I can put them in a more structured format and put a bit of narrative around it, just so that it makes sense in context of listening to this episode.
And remind us about your blog.
Yeah, you can find that at islandfortress.com.
Thank you. Now, you were going to ask me a little bit about a music program.
I was indeed. I just noticed the time. So yes, you're coming up with a sort of sister program to this, aren't you?
It's going to be called Rough and Rowdy Times. And I remember the film Good Morning Vietnam, where Robin Williams was this DJ playing all this music for. Predominantly, of course, the American troops stationed out in Vietnam, and I thought to myself, from the point of the 1930s, where British and American combatants in the Second World War were starting to, grow up, they themselves would have been familiar with a lot of music. Okay, yes, predominantly American music. But I thought, well, if you follow that thread through, all of the people involved in the Second World War, be it people in the factories, be it any of the combatants, being people stationed even overseas, and as the war, the deserts and wherever, all of these young men and women would have had musical favourites of their own, and they would have heard it over Forces Radio. So I'm going to put an hourly programme together that takes the music from probably the late 1920s all the way through, and I've got a cut-off point, and I'm saying the cut-off point, Nick, is the Cuban Missile Crisis, because effectively it's not just based around the Second World War. It goes through the Second World War, it goes through the Cold War, it goes through Korea, it goes through the British involvement in Kenya, Malaya, etc., right up to the Bay of Pigs Cuban Missile Crisis. And essentially, Nick, it's music that predates the Beatles, because when the Beatles came along, everything changed. So hopefully people that are interested in the Second World War are often, as you know, from all of the contacts you have, are people that are interested in other theatres, not confined to 1939, 1945. And I just thought this hourly programme that will probably go out after Islands at War, and can be found at Gnet Radio, Mixcloud. I thought they might enjoy the music from the times. It'll be varied. It'll be jazz, of course. It'll be popular song. There'll be some blues. There'll be the origins of country music. So the program is going to be called Rough and Rowdy Times, and hopefully we can have a bit of music that follows our peregrinations through the Second World War.
Excellent.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up now. We're only going to be able to have a snatch of 5 to 7 from Jim. Remember, you can get hold of Nick and I at occupied@gnetradio.com. But we'd be particularly interested in any questions about the fortifications of the Channel Islands in the period leading up to the Atlantic War, from the point when the Germans arrived. So thanks for listening, and be in touch. We'd love to get messages from you. We've had some wonderful stuff, especially from Andy Creeber, who's based in Canberra, Australia. So thanks very much. Over to Jim. Goodbye. See you in a couple of weeks. Say bye, Nick.
Bye.
Just put you gone to sleep.
I'm concentrating on the recording.
Okay, bye for now.
It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb.